Dracotail is projected to be one of, if not the best deck in the current metagame after the new support from Burst Protocol. In this masterclass, I'll go over everything you need to know in order to pick up and master the Dracotail deck, from showing you how to sequence your turns optimally to different builds of the deck you should know about. If you've ever wanted to learn how to play Dracotail competitively or understand it better in order to beat it, then this is the video for you. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Before I actually get started with the video, I just want to let you know that there are chapters that you can use to skip ahead to sections that you care about or skip past sections that you already know. But with that being said, I'm going to start off the first part of this masterclass by talking about the basics of Dracotail. So if you don't know what Dracotail does or you've seen it around but aren't too familiar with it, then this is the perfect section for you. So Dracotail as a whole is generally played as sort of this mid-rangey fusion deck. The main idea is that the Dracotail monsters are very good fusion material, so when they get fused off, some of them get a bonus effect, but all of them set a Dracotail spell trap from the deck after being fused. In particular, if you need help remembering, it's the Dragon Dracotail monsters that have extra effects when being fused off, in addition to setting the spells and traps, and the Spellcaster Dracotails don't have any bonus effect other than just setting the spell and trap. The way this deck is going to play is it's going to focus a lot on resource management. So their main fusion monster, Dracotail Arthalion, on summon allows them to add monsters back from the graveyard. So that can be the monsters that they use to fuse away for Arthalion, or it could even be cards like hand traps, since most of them are monster cards anyways. Not to mention, I'll talk a little bit more about the Dracotail traps in another section, but the basics of the trap is that they have some sort of effect, and then they get to recycle one Dracotail card from their graveyard or banish back to the bottom of the deck and draw a card. So not only do the traps cycle an extra card from the deck, they also give the Dracotail deck some ways to recycle like spells and traps that they already used. So in general, that's sort of the main idea of Dracotail. They just want to find a bunch of ways to fusion summon, whether that be through the Dracotail engine itself or through supplementary engines, which I'll talk more about in a further section as well. But as an overall summary of Dracotail, that's basically what they do. They'll generate a lot of resources whenever they fuse off Dracotail monsters from the hand, and they have a very good grind game because of their resource management capabilities. In this section, I want to talk about some of Dracotail's strengths. So if you're looking for maybe a reason to play Dracotail, then this could be it. So starting off with the first strength I want to talk about, it's that Dracotail is actually fairly consistent. In my opinion, even after the ban list that we just got with Malulu down to 1 and Ketu down to 1, generally the Dracotail deck is always going to play some additional ways to fusion summon. Upwards of like maybe 16 or 17 ways for the deck to be able to actually fuse off their monsters. All they're ever going to need is like one fusion effect to go through in order for them to start playing the game, because then they'll be able to not only start recycling cards off Arthalion, they'll also be able to start setting spells and traps off the Dracotail monsters. And because the engine is a little bit smaller now, especially with 2 less Malulu and 2 less Ketu, the deck still has a lot of room for high non-engine counts. And that's something that's pretty good in Dracotail in particular, because like I mentioned, Arthalion is able to add the monsters back from the graveyard to the hand. Another strength of Dracotail is that it's also quite resilient against most common hand traps. If you think about the most common hand traps that we have in the format, cards like Fua, the other most charming like Perulia and Meows. While a card like Fua can be decent against Dracotail, it's generally able to still set up a decent enough board while only giving your opponent 1 or maybe even 2 draws. It doesn't necessarily have to fully pop off in order to set up any form of an end board. Most of the time, Dracotail's end board is already going to be pretty simple and can be done in very few steps, meaning these like high impact cards like Charmies are not going to be super great. While cards like Ash Blossom and Ghost Spell can be pretty good against like the Dracotail trap cards, I still think in general, the Dracotail engine is fairly resilient. I think also one of my favorite parts about Dracotail personally is that the fact that it has very strong in-engine ways of breaking boards. Like I mentioned in an earlier section, the Dragon Dracotail monsters have that bonus effect when they're fused off to be able to interrupt the opponent in some way. For example, Malulu can non-targeting negate a monster your opponent controls permanently, Pan and Urgla can pop monsters and spell and traps respectively, all without targeting. So they can force your opponent into some very uncomfortable spots since none of their effects target, in addition to the fact that they advance your own game state as well by setting spells and traps in the deck. I think that's one of the Dracotail's greatest strength. It's just by playing the game and fusing off like these Dragon Dracotail monsters, you'll be able to break boards. And not to mention, even a card like Arthalion, while it's usually used to add some monsters back from the graveyard, can be used to bounce monsters on the field back to the hand as well if you ever need to remove something that way. And then finally, like I mentioned, it has a very solid grind game. Arthalion's going to be constantly adding back monsters for resources, and the Dracotail traps are usually cycling back extra copies of the trap to have sort of this infinite loop, but in some situations you can recycle your one of Ketu as well. Alright, so what are some of Dracotail's weaknesses? This section is going to be perfect for those who are looking for a way to counter the Dracotail deck. If you're not choosing to play this deck and you're wondering what the best place to stop it is, well, this section is for you. So starting off with what I think is probably Dracotail's like biggest perceived weakness. It's that the Dracotail engine alone just has a relatively low ceiling. It actually doesn't do that much in terms of an end board. Like a standard Dracotail combo will generally end on a single copy of Arthalion, which doesn't do anything after it's been summoned, a copy of Gulamel, which can be a potential pop 1 on the opponent's turn, and then all 3 Dracotail traps, with a copy of 5 mana in the hand and maybe some other Dracotail names. So while that end board isn't bad by any means, compared to like some of the other combo decks that we have, like these boards are actually quite breakable, especially when you start thinking about the fact that like the trap cards can be stopped by cards like Ash Blossom and Ghost Ball, which sort of bring me to my next point. The interruptions on the end board actually offer a lot of counterplay potential to your opponent. So even if you don't have cards like Ash Blossom or Ghost Ball to stop the trap cards outright, you can technically play around 2 of them. The first one being Dracotail Horn, which has to bounce an attack position monster on the field to the hand. So if you summon your monsters in defense mode, for example, that trap card will rarely ever get full value because they'll have to bounce their own monsters in order to get that draw. And perhaps the most well-known interaction is with Dracotail Flame. It kind of acts as a hot red dragon archfiend, meaning it has to successfully like negate the target on the field. So if that target gets removed somehow by, let's say, like a forbidden droplet, sending it for cost, then Flame is just going to fizzle and it's not going to be able to stop your spell card. So I think one of its biggest weaknesses is that its interruptions, like people can actually like beat them fairly easily, and since they're pretty much always going to be known interruptions, a competent opponent should have a fairly easy time at dismantling the board with the right hand. Dracotail players are also somewhat limited in terms of their deck building choices because they fundamentally have to focus on engines that allow them to play the game and fusion summon. I have seen Dracotail builds, for example, back in the day with max out copies of like K9 monsters, for example, because they're generic. Those ultimately don't really contribute to the Dracotail game plan because they don't allow the deck to fusion summon. So in some sense, they kind of are constrained in the deck building phase where they have to choose engines that work really well in helping the Dracotail deck like fusion summon more, which is the central game plan of the deck. And then finally, for the last weakness I want to talk about, the Dracotail deck has a bit of a normal summon problem. Maybe it's not so bad anymore with the limiting of Malulu down to 1, but before with 3 copies of Lucius, 3 copies of Malulu, whatever supplementary entry you're playing could include cards like Cartesia. If you're playing the Magistus stuff, for example, from the new Burst Protocol set, there's also more normal summons there. And I think sometimes that can lead to Dracotail sort of crumbling to just a single copy of like Imperm, for example, on their normal summon. While this of course isn't always going to happen, I think that is one key weakness to think of, because without a way to like put monsters on the board other than your normal summon and fusion summon, a really competent opponent can make it really difficult for the Dracotail player to play the game sometimes. And before I go any further into this video, I just want to ask you guys to please consider subscribing to the channel if this is something that you found helpful and enjoy so far. These videos take me a lot longer to make than my normal ones, so if you found it helpful, then all I ask is that you consider subscribing to the channel, and if you don't find it helpful, then let me know in the comment section below. Only a very tiny percentage of my viewers are subscribed, and by subscribing, you not only tell YouTube that you like this content and you want to see more of it in the future, you also give me the motivation to keep making more of these videos in the future to help you guys out. Alright, so in this section, I want to talk about what the general game plan for Dracotail is going first. So if you're just trying to pick up the deck and learn it from scratch, then this is definitely a section you want to take a look at. And if you just want to understand generally what the turn of Dracotail is going to look like in most cases, then this is also the right section for you. So the way the deck usually plays going first is like they're going to either summon or search for some sort of fusion enabler. This could include like normal summon Lucius to search 5 mana, or you can normal summon Lulu and try to use this effect. Or if you're playing like the Magistus engine, for example, you would go through your Spenta plays in order to get to a Lucius, and then Lucius would get into 5 mana. So generally the idea is like they generally always want to get access to a fusion enabler first. The next step that they're usually going to do is always fuse into Arthalion first, using like 1 or 2 Dracotail monsters. Add the monsters that they use to fuse like back to the hand. The Dracotail monsters are usually going to set copies of Ketu and Rahu in order to extend their plays further. Ketu, for example, can search for a copy of Lucius if they didn't already use their normal summon. Let's say they started with like 5 mana, for example. Or if they already used Lucius, they can search for extra copies of Dracotail names they haven't fused with yet in order to get even more fusion effects. And then at this point, the Dracotail player will usually consider like making some non-fusion plays before they're locking the fusion summoning off a card like Rahu. So for example, in the case where I mentioned where they normal summon Lucius, after they fuse into Arthalion, they can link away the Lucius into Spirit of Blue Eyes, link 1, and then link that in Arthalion into a seal before they actually lock themselves into fusion summoning only. Now at this point, the last part of their turn that they're going to do is usually use fusion lock cards. In most cases, this is going to be Rahu. They're just going to end their turn by activating Rahu, dumping a 5 mana and Urgla to the graveyard, and then setting like the Dracotail traps off of them. and then ultimately using a card like Urgla in order to add 5 mana from the graveyard back to the hand. So I guess the most important thing to remember at this step is like you always want to get Urgla into rotation to be able to add 5 mana back to the hand later on, and the best way to get to Urgla is usually through a card like Rahu, because you can directly dump it from your deck to the grave. So what does the deck actually do going second? I think this one is a little bit more interesting than the going first one, because I think there are a couple different things you need to consider. The first main, I guess, idea you want to consider as a Dracotail player is to force your opponent to deal with like multiple fusion outlets. So for example, if you're threatening to fuse like 2 or 3 times, your opponent's going to have to almost commit like everything they can in order to stop those outlets from resolving, because like I talked about earlier, the Dracotail dragons, for example, when they're fused off, they don't target with their interruption effects, making it very inconvenient for your opponent to use their interruptions at times. In particular, I want to talk about Ketu, because I think Ketu is definitely the best going second card in the Dracotail deck, simply because it not only gets you one of the pieces that you need from the deck, it also acts as a fusion spell at the same time. So this is one of the only ways you're ever going to be able to fuse with just 2 cards alone, with like, for example, Ketu plus any monster in hand, whereas with your other fusion outlets like 5 mana, for example, you generally need 5 mana and then 2 other monsters in your hand in order to fusion summon. So Ketu is able to help you maintain that high hand size, and it's able to make any dragon or spellcaster, not just the Dracotail monsters, meaning unless you want to like bait your opponent to using interruption super early, you probably generally want to hold Ketu to be your last like fusion summon, because it's going to be your most powerful one. I also think you want to prioritize getting access to the dragon Dracotail monsters from your deck, like Pan, Urgla, and Malulu, because like I mentioned, these interruption effects are very difficult for a lot of decks to deal with because they don't target. This could include things like searching them off of like Lucius if you have 5 mana already, or when you're activating a card like Rahu, you could dump these directly from the deck. So you really want to be cycling through usually 2 or even all 3 of the dragons in a single turn, just to interrupt your opponent as much as possible and while breaking their board. Another thing I think you should remember is that Arthalion can also be used to clear monsters on the board. So even though it's usually used to add resources back from the graveyard, you can just use it to clear big bodies off the board if you're trying to go for game, for example. And then finally, the last thing I think you want to consider when going second, some of your fusion outlets that don't actually lock you into fusion monsters only. So cards like Ketu, cards like 5 mana, like they actually don't lock you into fusion summoning like Malulu and Rahu do. And so there are going to be times where you can just easily get an Arthalion on the board with any other monster, and you can turn that into an SP Little Knight, for example. Just remember that you have the extra deck utility sometimes when you don't fuse with certain fusion outlets. And this could ultimately be the difference between like breaking a board or not being able to break it at all. Alright, so in this section, I just want to quickly go over the possible supplementary engines that you will see in like the best builds of Dracotail. For each of these, I'll be going over a sample build and also going over the main combo that you should be aware of when it comes to each of these variants. So the 3 most common builds of Dracotail that you're probably going to see, at least at the time of recording, are going to be Branded, Magistus, or like pure / like the dragon build. These can be combined in different ways because they are all fairly generic and they all work super well with the Dracotail cards. But also just keep in mind for the upcoming builds and combos I'm going to show, they're not the only builds of these decks that you can play, and they're not the only way to do these combos with these specific cards. These are just meant to give you an idea of what these engines can do and how the deck might look like when you do choose to play these engines. So for the first build I want to go over, that's going to be the Magistus / Branded build. You could play these separately, but I think the most common variant I've been seeing post-Burst Protocol at least does combine both of these engines, because like I said, both of these engines work really well together and don't really have any conflicts with each other. So in this list, you'll generally see that you're playing 3 of the best starters in each engine, being 3 Fallen and 3 Spoon. There are a couple of bricks that you do have to play in this variant, being, for example, the Ecclesia in the Fallen version and the Zoroa in the Magistus version. But ultimately, I think that these bricks are worth it because at worst, they are just monsters that you could fuse for like the Dracotail fusion monsters. So in theory, like none of these should really ever be so bad to where they actually hinder you and prevent you from winning the game. Now I'm going to be playing the combo for the Branded version of the deck in the background. I think this combo is actually pretty clean because there's quite a lot of flexibility with it. Of course, you're starting off with Fallen. You're going to be able to dump Albion. Albion's going to be able to get you access to a card like Fallen the Virtuous in the end phase. But I think the cool thing about this is that you get access to Cartesia in rotation. And Cartesia is one of the best end board pieces for Dracotail because it is able to act as that quick play fusion spell. So the way you get to Cartesia, of course, is through the Synchro monster, being able to summon it from the deck. And then as long as you have like Dracotail names in hand, you're going to be able to start setting cards like Ketu and Rahu to proceed further with your combo. I think the biggest thing you have to remember with this combo is that Fallen the White Dragon does lock you into like level 8 fusions or synchro monsters, so just keep in mind you can't make cards like Gulumelon, you can't necessarily go into extra cards like Seals, but other than that, I think this end board is pretty solid for the Branded version, especially because you have access to Fallen the Virtuous, which not every combo is going to have. The next combo I'm going to quickly go over is the Magistus combo. All it requires is Spoon and any monster, and I think that's something that's really neat. You'll generally be going through the Magistus part of the deck first, basically setting up the synchro monsters to pop the new invoked Magistus Omega card, and that's going to summon Lucius from the deck. And then Lucius is going to be able to get you access to the 5 mana, and then Lucius is going to give you that Dracotail name to start all your fusion plays with. So once you get to the Lucius part, the rest of it is pretty standard like Dracotail plays. You're just going to fuse it off, set cards like Ketu, Rahu, set your trap cards. But I think the cool thing about this combo is that not only do you not have to have any Dracotail names in hand, you also end with the Magistus Synchro on the end board, which is actually pretty good because it can floodgate your opponent out of like link effects or fusion effects, which can be really good in certain matchups. Especially if you know like what deck you're playing against, setting up that right Magistus monster in the graveyard can be incredibly powerful because not only do you have the full Dracotail setup, you also have an extra floodgate on your board that can be easily protected with the rest of your engine. So now that you've seen the two combos, you generally get an idea of like what both of these engines can do for the deck. I think both of these engines are going to be very viable ways to play Dracotail. You don't necessarily have to play both in the same deck. You could choose to play one or the other, but ultimately I think that both of these engines are very solid and very powerful ways to make the Dracotail deck a lot better. For the next sample version of the deck, I wanted to go over a quote-unquote dragon version, and basically the reason it's called dragon is because the main extra fusion outlets that you're playing are the dark end and light end level 8 dragons. Basically, the way these work is like you banish a level 8 dragon fusion from your extra deck, summon it from hand, and then you can use it to fusion summon into your dragon fusion monsters because they do lock you into dragons. But they don't lock you into fusion dragons only, so you can do things like make number 38 Hope Harbinger, since cards like Arthalion and the dark end and light end are level 8s, and you can make cards like Seals because all of them are dragon monsters at the end of the day. So I'm going to be quickly showing what the combo can do with like just one of the big dragons as well as like Dracotail names in hand. You'll notice that it's nothing too crazy. Like you'll start off by fusion summoning and then you can make both Seals and number 38 throughout your combo while still ending on pretty much the entire Dracotail end board. So even though these dragons do lock you into dragon monsters, that's actually not too detrimental for this deck because you don't necessarily need to end on Gulamel for your end board to be good. Cards like Seals and number 38 are incredibly powerful cards that not many decks can actually take advantage of in this format. So I think this is one build of the deck where if you're more interested in focusing on like the dragon side of the deck with like Seals and number 38, it's definitely something you could consider. And also if you're on a budget and simply just you don't want to pick up the new support from Burst Protocol like the Magistus or the Branded engine, then this version I think is definitely still very viable. It's one of the most budget-friendly versions of Dracotail that we have out there. For the last build I want to show, it's sort of like a quote-unquote pure build where you don't really play any supplementary engines, and I think this one personally is like the worst out of the three, but it's definitely still one possible way you could play Dracotail. The way that this deck is going to work is, I'm not really going to show a combo for this because most of the times your plays are just going to be standard Dracotail plays, and if you happen to have like extra Cartesia or a Lucius on the end board, you can end on a Seals as well. Nothing too crazy to show there. But the main strength of this deck, I think, is the fact that it's able to play a higher non-engine count than all the other previous versions of Dracotail because it doesn't need to fit in those supplementary engines. The only supplementary engine in here is just 3 copies of Cartesia. But in theory, this could be like 3 King of the Swamp and 1 Polymerization like they played back in the day. In addition, this version of the deck is also very budget friendly. You don't have to pick up any supplementary engines at all, basically. And so if you want to play Dracotail on a budget and don't want to pick up like the cards from Burst Protocol, I still think this is a decently viable version of the deck. I would say if you are on a budget, the Dragon version is probably a better bang for your buck, but this pure version, it really does take advantage of the fact that one of Dracotail's biggest strengths is that it's able to fully utilize any monster in the deck. Meaning, even if you draw a hand of like a bunch of hand traps and only like 1 or 2 Dracotail names, you're still able to play the game while stopping your opponent with those extra copies of your hand traps that you have. So for the last section of this video, I just want to go over the top 3 takeaways that you should get from this video. So if you skipped ahead here because you didn't watch the whole thing, or if you kind of forgot some of the things that I talked about, here are what I think are the 3 most important things to keep in mind when facing Dracotail or playing Dracotail. So the biggest thing I think you want to be aware of is that the key choke point in Dracotail is the fusion outlet. If your opponent either has no access to a fusion outlet or you're able to stop their fusion outlet from going through, let's say for example Dominus Impulse or Called by the Grave on 5 mana, or for example you imperma Malulu, the Dracotail deck is just not going to be able to really do anything with like all their Dracotail monsters in hand because they only are real cards once they're fused off basically. If you have a good way to cut off the Dracotail player from being able to fusion summon, you should definitely go that route when deciding what cards to stop against them. Conversely, as a Dracotail player, you really need to think about how many ways you have to fusion summon every single turn before you start playing your cards. You need to think about how many cards can I afford to try to bait my opponent with before actually you needing one to resolve. Another thing you want to keep in mind with Dracotail is that it is a deck that does need a fairly large hand size a lot of the times in order to consistently fusion summon, because all the Dracotail monsters do require at least 1 monster in the hand to be used as material. Something important to note as well is like when you use 5 mana to fuse from hand, 5 mana itself doesn't count as one of the materials, and so you need additional monsters on top of that in order to successfully fusion summon. So as the Dracotail player, if you're like constantly hand trapping your opponent, you just need to be cognizant of like, oh, I can't throw away like every single card in my hand in order to focus on stopping my opponent, because I won't be able to fusion summon into the monsters that I want to afterwards. Finally, I think maybe something that a lot of people might forget is that Dracotail names must be able to set Dracotail spell and traps from the deck in order to get the bonus effect. This is only relevant to the Dragon Dracotail monsters, but if your opponent isn't able to set a Dracotail spell or trap from the deck, they won't be able to get the bonus effect of the monsters that they're using to fuse away with. So something that you can look out for when you're playing against Dracotail is I count how many spells and traps that they actually use. Most lists are going to play 3 Rahu, 1 of each trap, and 1 copy of Ketu, so 7 Dracotail spell and traps in total. And so if you look through your opponent's graveyard and see that they're starting to run out of things and they aren't able to put them back with like the trap cards, then just be aware that your opponent can't use like the Dracotail dragon effects in order to like interrupt you further. And on the other hand, as a Dracotail player, something you want to be aware of is like not randomly just like willy-nilly using your Dracotail fusion effects just because you can. So like I said, during your turn 1, you're generally going to want to set Ketu, Rahu, and of course the 3 traps. But later on, when you're like fusing on your opponent's turn and you're not using like, let's say the Dracotail monsters to interrupt your opponent, if you're just fusing away like a spellcaster Dracotail, there is some argument to just not using its effect to set a copy of like a spell from the deck, because you want to save that for your more important dragon effects on the next turn. So just be aware that the Dracotail deck only plays a certain amount of spell and trap cards before it runs out, and so as a result, it's going to be possible that they're not always going to be able to get every single effect of the Dracotail monster when they fuse off. So just be sure you're keeping track of how many spells and traps the Dracotail player has used. And finally, before I end off the video, I just want to give a quick shout out to Card Trader. You can check them out using my affiliate link in the description below and use code tcgsam for 5% off your entire order while helping to support the channel. If you guys enjoyed this video, once again, I ask that you please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like on the video, and letting me know in the comments if this video helped you out. If you think I missed anything important as well when it comes to playing Dracotail, I'm also curious to hear your opinion, so do let me know too. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.